Shalom, friends. Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson here from the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. This is a time of incredible heat, incredible rage, and it's pouring out all over the place. So I want to invite you to step into an unusual spot. I want us to think about the morality and the values underneath what's happening, because if we can't find a way to do that, we will never find a way to talk to each other. And I want us to offer some wisdom from Torah and Jewish tradition. These have been unbelievable times in the United States and truthfully around the world. But in this country, a charged presidential election, probably more emotional, more divided than any in any of our lifetimes, possibly the most in the history of the country, with repeated charges that the elections are fraudulent, that they're stolen, although there has been no evidence to support that, and there have been repeated hearings and findings by courts with both Democratic and Republican judges, including judges appointed by President Trump, that have ruled that these are without merit, that it was a fair and open election process in which both candidates got more than any of their predecessors, but there was a definitive winner. Okay, but in that world in which the president and others are making these false charges of invalid elections, that turns opponents into enemies. We don't speak about people who differ from us ideologically as though they just disagree and we need to learn from each other. We talk about them as though they are vile, as though they are subhuman, as though they don't have any worth or values and not worth listening to. Democracies die when we can't hear each other. But it gets even worse than that. It turns into violence. Because if we all believe that there are people who are threatening to take away our country, well, we're going to fight them. And the challenge is that move to violence, that also destroys democracy. It destroys our ability to communicate and try to develop a new consensus. Okay, so we all know what happened. This unhealthy, toxic brew of false charges of invalid elections, this caricaturing each other as demons and enemies and villains, resulted in an outpouring that resulted last week in the Congress being stormed by hoodlums and thugs who wore anti-Semitic clothing, who shouted anti-Semitic and anti-black racist rhetoric, who threatened to kill the Speaker of the House, the Vice President of the United States, and this all seems to have been orchestrated at the very highest levels. It wasn't just a spontaneous outpouring. And so in that mix, I want us to think about one piece that religion can offer us a really important guide to. There have been voices since the assault on Congress, which, let's be honest, was an assault on democracy. There have been voices that have called for, let's unify. Let's not keep talking about it. Let's unify. Let's come together. Let's forgive each other. Let's start the healing process. And I want to warn us that that's deadly. If we try to heal by ignoring the real challenges, by ignoring the assault and by ignoring the differences of opinion, if we try to heal without insisting that people have evidence for the charges that they make, that we respect the courts of the United States, that we are a nation of laws and not of impulses, well, if we can't do that, that becomes a festering sickness. It's like putting a Band-Aid over a wound without treating the wound. It's like in a marriage, never talking about the areas of difference, and they just build and they build and they build until they explode. We saw that happen. Judaism has very clear teachings here. In order for there to be teshuvah, which is the process of turning back to wholeness, in order for there to be unity that is a healthy rather than a pathological unity, there needs to be 4 steps. The first is confession. There has to be an admission on the part of the individual, what have I done to contribute to this terrible scenario? How have I caricatured my ideological opponents? How have I marginalized groups of people? How have I supported insupportable things just because the person was on my side, which I would have condemned if that person were your person? Right? So we have to confess. There has to be a national confession of the kind of bubbling racism, anti-Semitism, the recourse to dog whistles to insult and diminish each other, the inability to respect each other and learn from each other. That has to be put out on the table. And those who have perpetuated or contributed to the violence, they need to admit that that's what they've been doing. Frankly, those who've been claiming that the elections are fraudulent need to atone for that sin by confessing too. But once you've spoken the words of a confession, then according to the Bible and Jewish tradition comes the repentance, the expression of regret. I see what I did, I see that what I did was wrong, and it pains me. That's the moment where you're no longer the perpetrator, where you've suddenly become the person who is in some ways victimized by your own previous error, your own previous sin. And then once you've regretted it, then you have to resolve to change. You have to say, I'm not going to be that person anymore. I am going to listen to the people I disagree with. I'm going to speak words that open the door for dialogue rather than brush them aside. And then finally there has to be repair. The ways that I contributed to ripping apart this society, I now need to positively contribute to the rebuilding. If we can commit to these 4 steps, to confession, to repentance and regret, to a resolution to change, and then a commitment to repair the breach, well then the unity is based on healing. Then the healing is deep and real. Then we are not papering over a festering sore that will explode again and again and again. But not until then. So before the calls for healing, before the calls for unity, which are based on falsehood and ignoring the problem, let's have the courage to face the issue and, like people who are inspired by the teachings of the Bible, to be honest, to hold to truth, to hold to our faith in open conversation with each other, so that with that respect for our dignity in each other, we're able to move forward. Only then can there be unity. Only then can there be healing. Shalom.